Thank you. And thank you, Tallene, for both your remarks. Let me just switch to my share screen and begin the presentation now. All right. I would like to thank everyone for showing up to this talk today. Whether you're here in the United States, Armenia, or elsewhere, your attendance of this presentation is greatly appreciated. I'd very much like to thank ARISC for organizing this talk and inviting me to speak about my research. I'd especially like also to express my gratitude to all the dedicated staff members at the archives and institutions in Armenia who have made so much of what I will be presenting here today possible. In the half century or so preceding the outbreak of the Great War of 1914, the world was convulsed by a series of trends, movements, and events that radically and irreversibly reshaped the lineaments of states and societies. From rebellions and wars in the United States and China to the laying down of underwater cables in the Atlantic and of railroad tracks in Siberia and the South Caucasus, the world heaved and groaned under the weight of changes that made societies remade societies, simultaneously bringing them ever closer together while also planting the seeds of conflict. How the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire responded to these developments that presaged modernity has long been something that I have asked in my time working on this period. The genocide of 1915, to say nothing about the other acts of Ottoman state-sanctioned violence that proceeded in the decades prior, exerts such a strong force on our imaginations that we would be forgiven to think that that history was awash with relentless massacres and bloodletting. Yet to accord such a wide berth to these events would mean to ignore other important events, movements, and above all, individuals who had a hand in shaping the fortunes of the empire. What sort of hopes and dreams did they cherish? How were they realized? How did they come to grief? What does this tell us about ourselves? And how can we begin to try to understand this other history? Well, history is nothing if not a product of inspiration and exploration. My understanding of Ottoman history has been deeply informed not only by my reading of the history of the Ottoman Empire, but also writings on empire, the nation, literature, anthropology, economics. I've benefited greatly by reading about other contemporary empires, such as that of the Habsburgs or the Romanovs, great states that once boasted sizable multi-ethnic populations of their own. The question raised in studies on Central Europe and Russia have often led me to ask similar ones in the case of the Ottomans. By the same token, cursory reading of Armenian periodicals has often provided fascinating glimpses to everyday life in the Ottoman and Russian empires. From their coverage of world events, their editorials on the pressing political and social issues of the day, and publication of advertisements for the newest manufactured items and fashions, they offer us some idea of what mattered to them and how they perceive the world around them. For historians, such sources may just be the first frames of reference to the more significant goings on in society and lead to further investigative work at libraries and archives. I don't want to belabor you all with all the finer details of my dissertation, nor spoil all the surprises, but perhaps what I can do is very briefly discuss just two themes that I work on, namely nationalism and collective identity taken together, and gender and sexual conduct in the early 20th century Ottoman Empire. Interestingly enough, my chapter on nationalism and identity owes its origins to an obscure reference in the British archives, which I only learned about in a book that was on British-Ottoman relations at the turn of the 20th century. However, I only had to tug at the thread for the whole yarn to unspool. Soon enough, I was reading about it in period newspapers and archival documents in Armenia and Turkey. Put briefly, this chapter of my dissertation looks at the celebrations Armenians held in the Ottoman Empire in October 1913 to commemorate the 1500th anniversary of the invention of the Armenian alphabet and the 4th centenary of the first printed Armenian book. From the imperial capital to the rural hamlet in the Anatolian periphery, Armenians packed churches, put on theatrical plays, organized lectures, took part in public processions, and adorned their spatial surroundings with the imagery and symbols of Armenian history and the alphabet itself. These were no isolated endeavors, for the 1913 Jubilee not only drew in the participation of other Christian and Muslim communities of the empire, but received the backing of the ruling Committee of Union and Progress government. That the Jubilee was universally upheld as an exemplary case of harmonious intercommunal relations between Armenians and Turks invites inquiry into this little-known event. My chapter sets the 1913 Jubilee against the political backdrop of the Second Constitutional Era in the Ottoman Empire, the period roughly encompassing 1908 to 1918, which briefly witnessed an efflorescence in political liberalization in the empire. Seen within this context, I examined how Ottoman Armenians gradually came to adopt new historical modes of understanding in the 19th century, how they contributed to the reimagining and reinterpretation of Armenian national selfhood, how something like the alphabet and reading became new markers of identity, and how Armenian history and cultural heritage were pressed into the service of politics. Above all, I try to understand how Armenians reconcile these concepts with their own status as imperial citizens. I don't really have time to discuss all the images and the text that you will see here, but this text in particular is what stood out in the course of my research when on the first day of the celebrations, a number of Ottoman dignitaries were invited to speak on the celebrations, and one of the people who we know purely because of completely different reasons, because of his role as the architect of the Armenian genocide, is making these sorts of remarks, which are very laudatory in terms of his praise for the Armenian people. And even though there's probably a certain kind of subtext to his remarks and what he's trying to argue, it is very fascinating for me just to encounter some of these people from history in completely different places and areas where we normally would not imagine them. But, I'd be happy to provide this text in case anybody's interested after the talk. My second dissertation chapter is rather more scaled down in comparison, yet it still seeks to confront a subject that, in my view, still remains understudied in the field, namely the evolution of gender relations and sexual conduct in the late Ottoman Empire. I propose we do this by reading the personal correspondence and other papers of two young individuals who were born in the last generation of Ottomans who came of age in the empire. As in life and so in death, Daniel Varajan earned renown for his poetry and intellectual talent. Yet much of his later success as a writer, as he probably would have himself admitted, could not have been possible without the support and encouragement of his loving wife, Araksi Tashjian. Daniel and Araksi consummated their relationship at a time when gender relations among Ottomans were still weighed down by stifling social conventions and patriarchal familial values. Reading their letters, we see not only the relationship of the two star-crossed lovers blossom, but how their characters grow together as well. Love is a pair of flowers, as Daniel tells Araksi in one letter to her. In Daniel, we see a writer slowly work his way toward literary prominence with the encouragement of his muse, his wife Araksi. In Araksi, on the other hand, we see a persistent and assiduous young woman who seeks to assert herself as a person in her own right. My dissertation is thus made up of these and several other discrete episodes from everyday Ottoman Armenian life. My aim is not necessarily to present a comprehensive portrait of the Imperial Armenian experience, but to demonstrate how they engaged and interacted with the ideas and phenomena we now associate with modernity. As I've tried to show today, the story includes larger-than-life personas who we are familiar with in other contexts. In line with the dissertation's narrative structure, they make return appearances throughout the chapters to illustrate their ability to operate on several different registers, whether it be politics, the economy, or culture. One further theme that I hope I will also be able to tease out in my dissertation is the interconnectedness between the Ottoman and Russian Armenian worlds. On the one hand, this is something that scholarship has long taken for granted. After all, it was only natural that the Armenians in the neighboring Russian Empire would display an affinity and concern for their brethren across the border. Yet a closer study of this period tells us that such relations could only have been consolidated thanks to the larger globalizing trends of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Thus, we see, for example, Russian Armenian educators arriving in Constantinople to take up positions as instructors and administrators in Armenian schools, imparting ideas and experiences that were born out of a different imperial context. We also see the transnational connections when funds are sent from Russian Armenian parishes to the more impoverished regions in the Ottoman Empire to help construct schools. The 1913 Jubilee was celebrated in Armenian communities throughout the world and indeed had been first proposed as an event that all Armenians participate in by the Armenian Catholicosate in Echmiadzin, in what was then the Russian Empire. Departing from more structuralist historiographical traditions by emphasizing the distinctive role that contingency played allows for more nuanced and imaginative interpretations. By foregrounding the agency of imperial citizens, how the choices politicians, intellectuals, clergymen, feminist authors, and others faced structured their perceptions, motivated their behavior, and imbued them with emotion and meaning, we can begin to make better sense of their lived experiences and the tumultuous political, social, and economic developments of the times. So what one may say, more than a century has gone by since the empire's collapse and the disappearance of these communities. Why should we care about the Armenians, who, after all, formed only 1% of the Ottoman Empire's population at the outbreak of World War I, and were not by and large in control of the country's governance and part of its state structure? I argue that we should care and listen to these individuals because no matter how remotely removed they are from us and our imaginations in the present day, they have much to offer us in not only understanding why certain events came to pass 100 years ago, but also what course they might take today. This arises from the fact that the questions that people once asked have not changed. Behind the Great Jubilee celebrations is a larger story of a community reconciling internal rifts made more pronounced by the new notions of race and nation that were emerging at the time. Geopolitical tensions and conflicts in Ukraine and Taiwan, on the other hand, invite comparison with great power diplomacy with the Ottoman Empire in the years leading up to the onset of the First World War. If we are to draw anything from these events, it is that the more we have come to learn about the past, the more we have come to see our reflection in them. And on that point, I would like to close with a quote by George Orwell, taken from his essay, The Lion and the Elephant, which was written shortly after Orwell's return to Britain from the Civil War in Spain. Talk to foreigners, read foreign books or newspapers, and you are brought back to the same thought. Yes, there is something distinctive and recognizable in English civilization. It is a culture as individual as that of Spain. It is somehow bound up with solid breakfasts and gloomy Sundays, a smoky towns and winding roads, green fields and red pillar boxes. It has a flavor of its own. Moreover, it is continuous. It stretches into the future and the past. There is something in it that persists, as in a living creature. What can the England of 1940 have in common with the England of 1840? But then what have you in common with the child of 5 whose photograph your mother keeps on the mantelpiece? Nothing, except that you happen to be the same person. Thank you.
Thank you, Armen. Thank you for this interesting presentation.